The snow was still coming down when the phone rang. I know that because I'd been sitting at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, watching it fall past the window above the sink, the way it always does in Portland in February, slow and indifferent, like the world had no particular opinion about anything. I had a cup of coffee in front of me that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. I hadn't touched it. I was just sitting there the way old men sit when the house is too quiet and the night is too long and there's nothing left to do but wait for morning. The clock on the microwave said 3:12. I let it ring twice before I moved. My name is Thomas Calloway. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in the same building where I'd once been a student myself, and I have the kind of face that students remember not because I was cruel, but because I was honest. My wife Margaret used to say I had a face that told the truth even when my mouth wasn't moving. She said it like it was a compliment. I think she meant it as one. I answered the phone on the third ring. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Young, professional, careful. She asked if I was Thomas Calloway. She asked if I was the father of Daniel Calloway, born March 9th, 1987, in Portland, Oregon. I didn't answer right away. Nobody had said my son's name to me like that, like he was a real person, a living person in 19 years. I set my hand flat on the table to steady myself. The wood was cold under my palm. I remember that. I remember the grain of it under my fingers and the sound of the snow and the way the refrigerator hummed in the corner, all of it suddenly very loud. "Yes," I said. "I'm his father." She told me her name was Dr. Anita Reyes. She told me she was calling from Street Mercy Hospital in Sacramento, California. She told me there was a patient in their care, a man in his mid-30s, admitted 6 days ago after a serious accident on Highway 50. She said the man had been unconscious for 4 of those days, and that when he woke up, he had almost no memory of who he was or where he'd come from. She said they'd been working with the information they had. She paused before the next part. She said they had found a name on a piece of paper folded inside the lining of his jacket. The paper was old and soft at the creases, like it had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. And the name on the paper was mine. I was standing by then, though I don't remember getting up. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly, "we believe your son may be alive. Let me tell you about Daniel. He was the kind of kid who made you believe in something, though I could never quite name what that something was. Maybe just the idea that people could be fundamentally good without trying very hard at it. He came into a room and people relaxed. He laughed easily. He had his mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looks amber when the light hits it right, and he had her patience, which was a kind of patience I never fully managed myself. He was 17 when Margaret got sick the first time. Lymphoma, the doctor said. We caught it early, they said. They were right. She fought it and she won. And Daniel sat with her every evening during the treatment, doing his homework on the chair beside her hospital bed, talking to her about his day like everything was normal. Like he was making it normal by insisting on it. He played baseball, not brilliantly, but with the kind of stubborn consistency that you have to respect, showing up to every practice, every game, never expecting to be the best, just refusing to be less than what he was capable of. His coach told me once that Daniel was the player every team needed and nobody wrote about. We were close. I want to say that clearly, because it matters to what happened later. We were close, the way fathers and sons sometimes aren't, especially when the father is a certain kind of quiet and the son needs a certain kind of openness. But Daniel made it easy. He just walked through whatever distance I put between us without seeming to notice it was there. He was 22 when he disappeared. It was the summer of 2009. He'd just finished his sophomore year at Oregon State. He'd been going through something, I knew that much, though I didn't know exactly what. Something with a girl, I thought. Something about not knowing what he wanted to study. The ordinary turbulence of being 22. I didn't push. I gave him space because I thought that was what he needed, and I have spent 19 years wondering if that was the worst decision I ever made. He left on a Tuesday morning in June. He told Margaret he was going to drive down the coast for a few days, maybe camp somewhere, clear his head. He kissed her on the cheek. He told me he'd call when he got to wherever he was going. He never called. For the first 3 days, we told ourselves he was fine. He'd always been responsible, always checked in, but he was 22 and maybe he'd just gotten caught up in being somewhere beautiful and forgot to call. We told ourselves that. We repeated it to each other in the evenings. On the fourth day, Margaret called the Oregon State Police. They found his car 11 days later. It was parked at a rest stop off Highway 1 near Crescent City, California, about 30 miles south of the Oregon border. The doors were unlocked. His wallet was on the seat. His phone was in the cup holder, dead. There was a duffel bag in the back with 2 days of clothes in it, neatly folded the way Margaret had taught him to fold things, which somehow made it worse. There was no Daniel. There was never any Daniel. The investigation lasted about 8 months in any real sense, and then it slowed, and then it stopped, and the case became one of those open files that nobody officially closes but nobody actively works either. A detective named Paulson called us every few months for a while, and then less often, and then not at all. We hired a private investigator in 2011 who found nothing and took most of our savings. We put up flyers that turned gray in the rain and curled at the corners. We went on the news twice. We did everything the parents of missing people do, and none of it brought Daniel home. In 2014, some remains were recovered from the woods about 40 miles inland from where Daniel's car had been found. Male, the medical examiner said. Mid-20s. The decomposition was too advanced for a reliable visual identification. They had dental records. They had a DNA sample we'd provided. They told us they had an 83% confidence match. The detective called on a Thursday afternoon in October. Margaret was in the garden. I watched her through the kitchen window while Paulson talked. She was deadheading her roses, moving slowly along the row, not thinking about anything in particular. I remember thinking I did not want to have to walk out there. I remember standing very still and thinking I would give anything in the world to not have to walk out that door. We buried our son in November. The casket was closed. Margaret wore her blue coat. The one Daniel had always said made her look like a movie star. I held her hand through the whole service, and neither of us spoke very much afterward for a long time. We moved through that winter like people moving through water. You don't recover from something like that, not completely. You learn to carry it. You learn to put one foot in front of the other and find reasons for the next hour, and then the hour after that. Our daughter Claire, she's 3 years younger than Daniel, she was the one who held things together that first year. She drove up from San Francisco on weekends. She cooked. She made sure her mother was eating. She had the practical courage that grief requires, and that I, in those months, completely lacked. I am not ashamed to say that. Grief broke me in ways I hadn't expected, and it took longer to put myself back together than I would have liked. Margaret passed away in 2019 from a cardiac event. It was quick. She was in the living room watching the evening news, and then she wasn't there anymore. That's the best way I can describe it, that the room she'd lived in for 30 years simply stopped having her in it. The grief from that was different from losing Daniel. Quieter, somehow? Wider? I have lived alone in this house since then. Claire calls every Sunday. She has 2 kids now, a boy and a girl, and she sends pictures regularly. And sometimes in the summers they come up and the house fills with noise again for a few weeks, which I love and which also, if I'm being honest, frightens me a little because of how good it feels. I am telling you all of this because I need you to understand what kind of silence Dr. Reyes's phone call broke. 19 years of one kind of life. 19 years of a world in which Daniel was gone. 19 years of having made a kind of peace, imperfect, incomplete, but real with the fact that my son was not coming back. And then 12 inches the morning, and a voice saying his name. I was on the road by 5. I didn't call Claire. I made that decision consciously, in the moment, and I've thought about it since. I didn't call her because I didn't know what I would say. I didn't call her because I was afraid that saying it out loud to someone I loved would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to handle yet, or would make it false in a way I couldn't bear. I needed to drive. I needed the 6 hours of I-5 between Portland and Sacramento to exist somewhere between believing and not believing, and I needed to do that alone. I drove south through the dark with the radio off. The snow gave way to rain south of Eugene, and the rain to clear skies somewhere around Redding. And by the time the Sacramento skyline came up out of the valley, the morning was bright and cold and painfully ordinary. I remember thinking, the world looks exactly the same. Birds, traffic, a woman walking a dog by the highway on-ramp. All of it exactly as it was before the phone rang. I had talked to Dr. Reyes again during the drive at a rest stop outside Medford. She was careful and warm and clearly understood what this was. She told me the patient had no ID on him when he was brought in, no phone, nothing but the clothes he was wearing and that folded piece of paper in the jacket lining. She said he'd been in a single vehicle accident. His truck had gone off the road on an icy stretch of Highway 50 east of Placerville. He'd been found by another driver about 2 hours after the crash. She said his memory was still patchy. He knew some things, his first name, fragments of places, a handful of images that didn't connect to anything he could name. He was calm, she said, not distressed in the way you might expect. She said he seemed like a man who had been living with a certain kind of uncertainty for a long time, and that this was perhaps just another version of it. I asked if he had asked for me. She was quiet for just a moment. She said, "He asked if you still lived in the house with the red door." "I have a red door. I have had a red door for 37 years. Since the summer Margaret and I bought the house, and she stood in front of the hardware store paint display for 20 minutes before pointing to a color called Barn Ember and saying that was it, that was the one. She said a red door meant the house was happy to see you coming. I have repainted it 4 times since, always the same color. After Margaret died, I thought about changing it, and then I didn't, and now I understand why. I stood in the rest stop parking lot in the early morning with the phone to my ear, and I said, yes, the door is still red. Street Mercy Hospital is on the east side of Sacramento. A wide beige building set back from the road with a parking structure that takes 10 minutes to navigate. I sat in the car on the 4th level for a while, after I found a space. I don't know how long. Long enough for the engine to go quiet and for the silence to come back. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I was 64 years old. I had buried my son and my wife and whatever version of myself existed before 2009, and I was sitting in a parking garage in Sacramento, afraid to go inside because of what I might find. Because there were 2 possibilities, and both of them terrified me. The first was that the man in that hospital room was not Daniel, that he was someone else who happened to have a piece of paper with my name on it, that I would walk in and look at a stranger's face, and drive back to Portland alone with everything exactly as it had been the day before. The second possibility frightened me more. I went inside. Dr. Reyes met me in the lobby. She was younger than her voice had suggested, early 40s, I guessed, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of steady calm that comes either from training or from something deeper. She shook my hand and held it for a second longer than a handshake usually lasts. I appreciated that. She walked me through what she knew. The patient, she was still calling him the patient at that point, carefully, which I also appreciated had been in their care for 6 days. The head injury was serious but not permanently damaging, she believed. His memory loss appeared to be what she called dissociative, as well as physical, meaning it wasn't only the concussion. She said sometimes trauma, long-term and accumulated, could produce these kinds of gaps, the mind protecting itself. I asked her about the DNA. She said they'd run a test as soon as they understood the situation. She said the results had come back that morning, before she called me. She stopped walking. She looked at me with that same quiet steadiness. She said, "Mr. Calloway, the DNA confirms it. He's your son." I have tried a number of times since then to find the right words for what happened to me in that hospital corridor in the moment she said those words, and I haven't been able to do it. It wasn't what I expected, which was a flood of something, relief or joy or grief or all of it at once. It was more like a structure collapsing. The careful architecture of the last 19 years, the understanding I had reached, the peace I had built, the way I had learned to speak about Daniel in the past tense without my voice breaking, all of it fell apart in about 3 seconds. I put my hand on the wall. I stayed there for a moment. Dr. Reyes put her hand lightly on my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Then she walked me to room 214. The door was partially open. She knocked twice, softly, and pushed it wider. He was sitting up in the bed. He was 37 years old. He was thinner than I remembered. The face was sharper, the shoulders narrower, the kind of thinness that speaks of years rather than days. He had a bandage on his left temple and a split on his lower lip that was healing. His hair was longer than it had ever been when I knew him, dark brown going gray at the sides, in a way that startled me more than anything else, because I had last seen him at 22, and gray hair at the temples was a thing I had never imagined for him. His eyes were the same. That amber brown when the light hits it right. Margaret's eyes exactly. He looked at me, and something in his face shifted, not recognition. Not exactly. Not the sudden, absolute knowing that you see in movies. Something slower than that. Something like a word arriving in a language you thought you'd forgotten. "Hi," he said. His voice was quiet and a little rough from the injury. I stepped into the room. My legs were working on their own. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at my son, and I tried to find something to say that wasn't completely inadequate, and I couldn't. "Hi," I said back. We sat together for a long time before we talked about anything real. Dr. Reyes brought a chair for me and then left us, and there was a long silence that didn't feel uncomfortable, just necessary, like we were both allowing something to settle, some impossible rearrangement of the world that needed a moment to complete itself. I told him his name. I told him his birthday and where he was born and the name of his mother, and I watched his face as I said each thing, looking for the places where it landed. Some of it seemed to touch something in him. Some of it didn't reach. The memory, Dr. Reyes had told me, might come back in full, or in pieces, or it might not come back in a particular order. There was no predicting it. I told him about the red door. He said, "I knew it was red. I've known that for a long time. I couldn't remember why." I told him about Margaret. I told him she was gone, and that was one of the hardest things I've ever said to another person. Watching his face when I said it, the flash of something, a loss that couldn't fully find its name yet, because he was mourning someone he could not quite remember. "That is a grief I don't have a word for," he said. "She loved roses." I said yes. He said, "Pink ones." I said yes. Pink and a few white. She always complained that the white ones didn't perform as well, but she kept planting them anyway because she liked the contrast. He smiled at that, small and careful, like he wasn't sure his face still knew how. I asked him, eventually, carefully, about the years between. Not all at once. Over time, over several visits in the days that followed, the pieces came together incomplete, non-linear, some of it hazy and uncertain, in ways that may never fully clear. What I understand now is this. He had left that Tuesday in June in a state that I had not fully recognized as serious. Not just turbulence. Something darker than that. He had driven down the coast without a destination, stopped at the rest stop, walked into the trees, and stayed there not by any deliberate plan, but because he couldn't make himself get back in the car. The human mind in certain kinds of crisis stops being able to imagine the future, even the next hour. He couldn't see what came next, so he stopped. He had been found by a man camping in the area who helped him, didn't ask many questions, let him stay for a few weeks. After that movement, seasonal work, orchards, mostly, Central California, parts of Nevada. Keeping to himself, using cash, not seeking anything in particular, a kind of drifting that had its own rhythm. He knew his name, he knew fragments, but there was something in him that had severed the line back to everything that name meant. And for years he had let it stay severed because going back felt impossible, and staying gone felt survivable. He had kept the paper with my name on it. That's the thing I kept returning to. Through all of it, the years, the distance, whatever complicated exile he'd been living inside, he had kept a piece of paper folded in the lining of his jacket with my name and phone number on it. He didn't know when he'd put it there. He didn't know if it had always been in that jacket or if he'd moved it from another one at some point. He just knew he hadn't been able to throw it away. I asked him why not. He thought about it for a while. He said, "I think I was saving it." "For what?" He looked at the window. The Sacramento light in mid-February is pale and thin, not much warmth to it. He was quiet for a moment. "For when I was ready," he said. I want to say something here about anger, because people have asked me about it. Claire asked me about it. A friend asked me about it, whether I was angry at Daniel for what he'd put us through, for the years of not knowing, for the investigation and the costs and the grief and the burial of what turned out to be someone else. Whether I felt, underneath everything else, a rage that he had chosen this. The honest answer is, not then. Not in those first days. Maybe that's something that comes later, in a different form, in the ordinary negotiations of trying to rebuild a relationship after something like this. Maybe there is something that needs to be worked through, and it will take time and probably some difficult conversations and perhaps someone else in the room to help us do it right. But in that hospital room, no. What I felt was not anger. What I felt was the particular gratitude of a man who had been carrying the weight of an absence for 19 years and had set it down. It was not all the way joy. It was something quieter and stranger than joy. It was just the weight lifting. Claire came down on the third day. She was, I don't quite have the word for what Claire was. She stood in the doorway of room 214 and looked at her brother, and then she walked to the bed and sat on the edge of it and took his hands and held them for about 3 minutes without saying anything. Daniel cried. Claire did not right then. She held it with the same practical courage she'd brought to every hard thing. Later, in the hallway, I heard her crying very quietly, alone. She did not ask him why, not yet. She understood, I think, what I had understood, that there was time for that, and the time was not now. She brought photographs. She'd gone through old boxes before she drove up, and she brought a folder of printed photos, birthday parties, vacations. The summer we rented a cabin on the coast when Daniel was 12, and Claire was 9, and both of them spent 3 days convinced there was a ghost in the attic. Daniel looked at each one slowly, turning them in his hands like he was reading something in a foreign language that he'd once known well and was beginning to remember. There was a picture of the 4 of us in front of the house. Summer, probably 2003 or 2004. Margaret and I are standing side by side, squinting slightly into the sun. Claire is on my left, 12 years old, already with that particular expression she has, where she is tolerating the photo but barely. Daniel is on the right, and he is laughing at something just outside the frame, mouth open, the way he used to laugh full and without reservation. He held that picture longer than the others. I noticed what he was looking at. Behind us, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, the red door. He set the photo down on the blanket and left his hand on it. I want to see the house, he said. It took 3 more weeks before he was medically cleared to travel. The head injury required monitoring. The memory was assessed again and again, and Dr. Reyes sat with us several times to explain what was happening in terms I mostly followed and some I didn't. There was a counselor she brought in, a man named Ferris, who had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like interrogation. He worked with Daniel every day. He worked with me twice, which I hadn't expected, and found more useful than I would have predicted. On a Tuesday in early March, I noticed the day. Didn't say anything about it. We drove out of Sacramento. I had rented a larger car for the trip back. Daniel rode in the passenger seat. Claire followed in her own car, driving up to Portland before going back to San Francisco. We stopped twice on the way up. We talked. We didn't talk. We listened to the radio, and at one point Daniel laughed at something a radio host said, and it sounded different from his laugh in the hospital lighter, more like I remembered. I didn't say anything. I just noted it. We came off the highway into Portland as the afternoon was going soft, that late winter light that makes the city look like a painting of itself. I took the surface streets instead of the direct route, without planning to. I went slowly. We turned onto our street. The house looked the way it always does, modest, familiar, the oak in the front yard still leafless in March, the garden Margaret kept along the front walk still waiting for spring. Everything in its place, unchanged. I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. Daniel was quiet. He was looking at the door. We sat there for a moment, the way you sit when something is ending and beginning at the same time and you don't want to rush it. He got out of the car. He walked up the front path. He stood in front of the door the barn ember red, the color his mother chose 37 years ago because she said it meant the house was happy to see you coming. He put his hand flat on it. Not to knock, not to open it, just to touch it. The way you might touch something you thought you'd lost, before you do anything else. I stood on the path behind him and said nothing. After a moment he turned around. His eyes were wet, and he looked like himself, like the version of himself I had held in memory for 19 years, and he also looked like a man I didn't entirely know yet, which is simply the truth of where we are. There is work ahead of us. There are conversations we haven't had, things that haven't been named, grief that belongs to both of us that we'll need to figure out how to share. It won't be easy, and I won't pretend I know how it goes. But he was there. He was standing on the path in front of the house where he grew up, and the door behind him was red, and the oak in the yard was beginning, very slowly, to show the first small suggestion of buds. He said, "Can we go in?" I said, "That's what the door's for." He smiled at that. Small and careful like before, but wider now. I unlocked the door, and we went inside. There isn't a tidy ending to give you, because life doesn't run that way. Daniel is staying in the house for now. He sleeps in his old room, which has been a guest room for years, but which I never quite managed to make feel like one. The bookshelves still hold some of his things. The old baseball trophy still sits on the top shelf, still slightly tilted, the way it's always been tilted. He sees a therapist 3 times a week. His memory continues to return in its own order, its own time. Some mornings he comes downstairs and tells me something he remembered in the night. A smell, a sound, a fragment. And we sit at the kitchen table and talk about it. Claire calls every Sunday, and now sometimes he answers. Last week I found him in the back garden, standing where Margaret's roses are. It was a gray morning, still cold, the ground not ready for anything yet. He was just standing there looking at the bare canes sticking up from the mulch. I came up beside him. He said, "I want to be here when they bloom." I said, "They bloom in June." He nodded like that was a reasonable amount of time to plan for, and we stood there together in the gray morning for a while. Just the 2 of us, in the garden where his mother used to walk. I thought about what it means to wait for something. I have been waiting, in one form or another, for 19 years. Waiting for a call, or a letter, or some word from the direction my son went when he drove away from everything. And it's strange to be on the other side of that waiting. Not because the hard things are finished, they're not. But because the particular loneliness of not knowing is done. I have my son. He's different than he was. I am different too, older and quieter, and not always sure of the right thing to say. We are learning each other again, which is something I didn't know would happen, but which makes sense when I think about it. We were one kind of father and son before. We are becoming another kind now, starting with the garden and the red door and the kitchen table and the coffee in the morning, and going from there. The roses will come in June. We'll be here.